Introduction. Why Sanna Marin's term as Prime Minister demands a critical reckoning. This is a documentary work about Sanna Marin and her term as Prime Minister from 2019 to 2023. This work does not construct a legend, nor does it attempt to dismantle one. Its task is simpler and far more demanding. To separate decisions from images, anchor them in official records, and show what followed, measured in euros, in structures, and in the everyday machinery of government. Finland is not a large country. It is a small, open economy where every decision measured in billions is felt almost immediately. When we speak of deficits and debt, we are speaking of room to maneuver, of what future governments will still be able to do. In a small state, mistakes do not dissolve into scale. They accumulate. One of the defining characteristics of Finland's public finances is the sheer size of its public sector relative to the economy. In 2024, public expenditure, state, municipalities, and social security funds combined, exceeded 55% of gross domestic product. This level is markedly higher than in most other OECD countries, whose averages remain significantly lower. In 2021, public spending in Finland stood at approximately 56% of gross domestic product, while many comparable countries remained well below that threshold. This means that the public sector, its services, systems, and administrative structures, is among the largest in the economy when measured by output. Its scale is visible not only in spending, but also in employment. Roughly 1/4 of all workers are employed within the public sector. Why does this matter? When the public sector is already expansive, every major reform, such as the restructuring of social and healthcare, structurally enlarges the state and the financing it requires. This is not about a single expense. It is about maintaining an entire service system for decades to come. Economic figures are not opinions, they are measurements. According to official statistics, public finances slipped into deep deficit and public debt grew rapidly. This alone does not prove the guilt of any single individual, but it does prove that decisions were made at a specific time and in a specific manner that narrowed Finland's future room for action. When fiscal discipline is not restored after exceptional circumstances, the exception becomes permanent. Why did this happen? Why, at the very moment when the fundamentals of the economy were deteriorating, did public debate drift toward images, symbols, and personal branding? Why were words like historic and bold considered sufficient explanations, while calculations and consequences were pushed aside? This work does not focus on a single scandal. Not one night, not one video, not one headline. It focuses on the whole, the exercise of power, the decisions made, and the boundaries of responsibility. On what happens when the role of the Prime Minister blurs between the private and the public, and how that erosion reflects back on trust and the capacity of governance. Sanna Marin became an international phenomenon. That is a fact. A phenomenon is neither a crime nor an achievement in itself, but it raises an unavoidable question. Did the phenomenon eclipse accountability? When awards and honors dominate the headlines, who still asks what concrete achievement they are meant to recognize? This work examines power on two levels. The first is the level of decisions. What was decided, how financing was constructed, and what corrections had to be made afterward. The second is the level of responsibility, how the role of the Prime Minister was understood and how its boundaries were defined in practice. When the head of the executive branch acts, nothing is ever fully private. This is not a moral sermon. This is an examination of responsibility. Legal assessments and official rulings demonstrate that the boundaries of the role are not self-evident. They require constant judgment. And that is precisely why they must be discussed openly, not buried in silence. At the center of this work stands the reform of the social and healthcare system. When an entire service structure and its financing are rebuilt, this is not a matter of ideology. It is a matter of arithmetic. When cost control fails, the consequences are not temporary. They are structural. Once the system is launched and deficits begin to accumulate, later flexibility and corrective measures do not undo the original error. They merely push the bill forward. This work follows the chain without excuses. Decision, implementation, financial outcome, corrective move. Sanna Marin is the subject of this work because she led the government at a time when Finland rapidly lost fiscal maneuvering space, not because she was visible, but because she was responsible. Critical scrutiny is not an attack. It is the minimum requirement of democracy. Power must not be judged by how it appears, but by what it does, and by what remains after it has passed. This is a documentary work. It does not ask the listener to believe. It asks the listener to look. Chapter 1. Sanna Marin in power. Sanna Marin rose to the position of Prime Minister of Finland in December 2019, in a situation where her personal political experience at the highest level of state leadership was limited. Yet her symbolic significance was exceptional. At the age of 34, she became the youngest sitting prime minister in the world, and this fact immediately became the defining frame of her leadership, not through achievements, but through age, gender, and narrative. This is not an opinion, but an observation of how her term in office was framed from the outset in the media and political discourse. Marin's appointment was not based on an electoral victory, nor on a personal mandate from the electorate. She was not the prime ministerial candidate in the 2019 parliamentary elections, but ascended to the position following Antti Rinne's resignation through internal decision-making within the Social Democratic Party. Constitutionally, the procedure was impeccable, but politically, it created a situation in which an unusually extensive concentration of power was placed in the hands of a person who had not been tested in nationwide executive responsibility under crisis conditions. This setting is essential when evaluating the quality of the decisions that followed. Marin's leadership style was built early on two pillars: centralized use of power and strict control of communication. During the coronavirus pandemic, government press conferences became frequent, yet at the same time, internal preparation, alternative policy lines, and critical assessments largely disappeared from public view. Decisions were presented as necessities rather than choices. This narrowed democratic debate and created the impression that responsibility was collective, while power itself was personalized. Marin consistently presented herself as a crisis leader, but closer scrutiny reveals a contradiction between performance and responsibility. When decisions proved problematic or costly, accountability was dispersed to authorities, previous governments, or exceptional circumstances. The Prime Minister's own role as the principal architect of policy direction often remained verbally thin. This pattern repeated across multiple policy areas and was not a series of isolated missteps, but a mode of operation. Public behavior and private leisure activities became an unusually central part of political debate during Marin's tenure. The problem was not partying as such, but the blurring of the boundaries of the prime ministerial role. When attention focused on party videos, outfits, and social media images, scrutiny shifted away from the substance of power. This did not happen by accident. A personal brand began to take on a life of its own, and in doing so, it shielded decision-making from critical evaluation. It is essential to note that criticism of Marin's leadership was often labelled as a personal attack or misogyny. This made it difficult to engage in substantive discussion about the impacts, costs, and alternatives of political decisions. The issue was not who Marin was, but what her government did and failed to do. In this respect, the public discourse climate served the exercise of power rather than democracy. In a small state like Finland, the role of the Prime Minister is not symbolic. It is a structural, economic, and moral responsibility. Every decision measured in billions carries proportionally greater weight than in large economies. From this perspective, Marin's leadership appears as a risky combination of inexperience, ideological certainty, and the expanded room for maneuver provided by exceptional circumstances. Chapter 1 does not claim that Sanna Marin failed at everything. It demonstrates that her authority was constructed in a way that weakened the attribution of responsibility and critical scrutiny. This framework is necessary so that the following chapters can examine concrete decisions without myths, adulation, or demonization. The question is not what kind of person Sanna Marin was. The question is what kind of leadership Finland received, and at what cost. Public image, untouchability, and the role of the media. Sanna Marin rose to power at the moment when political leadership and the media entered a new kind of relationship. Her public image was constructed with exceptional speed. Young age, modern aesthetics, and intense international attention shaped a narrative in which symbols and impressions began to outweigh the concrete consequences of decision-making. This chapter examines how that image was formed, why it acquired traits of untouchability, and what role the media played in muting critical scrutiny. Even before the midpoint of her term, Marin became an icon of international media. Foreign outlets and global rankings emphasized her new kind of leadership, her fearlessness, and her coolness, often detached from Finland's fiscal data and structural reforms. Domestic media followed the same framing. The message was clear. The Prime Minister was presented as a progressive brand rather than primarily as the person responsible for the state's finances. This framing was not accidental, but the result of an interaction between media logic and political communication, where visuals and personal narratives took precedence. The media's critical tradition, dissecting the impacts of decisions, weighing alternatives, and naming mistakes, was often pushed into the background. Exceptional circumstances, the coronavirus pandemic, a major shift in security policy, understandably created pressure for national unity, but they also provided a protective shell within which economic and administrative decisions were made without sufficient retrospective accountability. The fundamental question, what does this cost and who pays, was repeatedly left unanswered or deferred to the future. The untouchability of the public image became visible in how criticism was interpreted. Substantive concerns about the growth of public debt, the expansion of the public sector, or the unfinished nature of reforms were frequently framed as personal attacks. This shifted the discussion from substance to motives. The critic was easily labelled malicious or out of touch with the spirit of the times. When criticism becomes personalized, the issue itself disappears. A comparison with previous prime ministers reveals the anomaly. Earlier governments faced harsh economic scrutiny without comparable protection. In their cases, figures and structures dominated the front pages. In Marin's case, style, symbolism, and international admiration often took precedence. This does not deny that there was inappropriate and condemnable personal hostility directed at her. There was, and it should be rejected. But at the same time, an atmosphere emerged in which legitimate criticism was deliberately conflated with illegitimate attacks, effectively silencing critical debate. The role of the media is central here. When a prime minister is treated primarily as a phenomenon rather than as a decision-maker, an imbalance between power and responsibility emerges. Power is exercised, responsibility is postponed. The public image offers protection, but it is deceptive. It does not erase the consequences of decisions, it merely delays confronting them. When fiscal realities finally surface, they appear as a surprise, even though they were visible all along. The conclusion of this chapter is simple but uncomfortable. The public image cultivated during Marin's term created a form of untouchability that weakened democratic accountability. The media did not create this alone, but it reinforced it. Critical journalism does not fail because power is young or popular. It fails when imagery replaces metrics. When that happens, the state pays the price, often with a delay, but always in real terms. Chapter 3. One of the largest public sectors in the world. Finland's public sector is an anomaly. A small country with a population of just over 5.6 million maintains an administrative and financial structure that, in many respects, rivals those of countries several times its size. This is not an ideological claim, but a recurring observation in international comparisons, where Finland consistently ranks among the top OECD countries in terms of public expenditure and the share of employment in the public sector. When the public sector is this large, every decision carries greater weight. Every mistake costs more. Every structural lock-in becomes harder to dismantle. At this scale, there is no room for experimentation, ideological leaps, or vague promises of future efficiency. A starting point that was deliberately ignored. When Sanna Marin assumed office as Prime Minister, Finland was not a light state. The public sector was already extensive, taxation was high, and the population structure was aging rapidly. Fiscal room for maneuver was limited, and experts had warned for years that expenditure growth would, in the long run, exceed the economy's capacity to sustain it. Despite this, the size of the public sector was not treated as a risk, but almost as an intrinsic value. The debate did not concern how large the Finnish state could realistically be, but how many new responsibilities could still be assigned to public authority. Administrative layering. Responsibility dissolves into structures. The problem of the public sector is not a single agency or ministry. The problem is layering. Ministries, agencies, regional administration, municipalities, well-being regions, public enterprises, and state-owned companies form a system in which responsibility is diffused and decision-making slows. The Marin government did not dismantle this structure. It added an entirely new massive layer to it. The well-being regions were created in a situation where existing administrative structures were not dismantled in parallel, and where cost control mechanisms were not built sufficiently tight from the outset. When a new administrative tier is added without corresponding simplification elsewhere, permanent expenditure is unavoidable. This is not a value judgment. It is an administrative fact. The public sector as an employer, a false metric of success. A common defense is that the public sector creates jobs. This is true, but misleading. Employment alone says nothing about productivity, effectiveness, or fiscal sustainability. The public sector does not generate the tax base, it consumes it. As an ever larger share of the workforce moves onto public payrolls, the private sector narrows. This erodes the tax base upon which the entire system depends. The result is a paradox. The system grows while its financial foundation weakens. Leadership, salaries, and the absence of accountability. One particularly revealing feature of the Marin era was the consolidation of salary structures for top public sector management. Leaders of well-being regions and major public organizations were assigned pay levels that, in many cases, exceeded those of the political leadership, even that of the Prime Minister. Compensation in itself is not the problem. The problem arises when pay becomes detached from results and accountability. When deficits grow, services deteriorate, and the system demands continuous additional funding, yet leadership remains unchanged. The issue is no longer about money, but about a culture of responsibility. Political responsibility, the burden of awareness. Sanna Marin was not an outsider. She held a master's degree in administrative sciences with education and academic focus specifically centered on municipal and regional governance. Her master's thesis examined the professionalization of political leadership in Finnish municipalities. For this very reason, her responsibility is heavier than that of many of her predecessors. When a prime minister with such a background accepts the expansion of the public sector without a binding and functional cost discipline, this is not ignorance. It is a conscious political choice. Why this chapter is indispensable. Without this chapter, the well-being region reform would appear as a single failed project. Without this chapter, the growth of state debt would appear merely as a consequence of exceptional times. But the truth is more systematic and darker. The public sector was already too large for an economy the size of Finland's before Marin. During her term, this was not corrected. The structure was locked into an even heavier form. The result is a system that produces deficits automatically, without the need for new decisions. Subsequent governments will not inherit only debt. They will inherit a structure that is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle without painful choices. For this reason, the next chapter turns to the moment when this bloated machinery was given a new, uncontrolled source of momentum. The birth of the well-being region reform and its economic consequences. Chapter 4. The Well-being Services, Counties Reform, an Engine of Public Sector Expansion. To understand the significance of the well-being services counties reform, one must first grasp the structural nature of Finland's public sector. Finland is a small country of roughly 5.6 million people, yet its public sector is exceptionally large by international comparison. Public authority penetrates deeply into the economy. The state, municipalities, and joint municipal bodies have traditionally been responsible for healthcare, social services, education, infrastructure, and a substantial share of total employment. Prior to the well-being services counties reform, municipalities organized social and healthcare services and bore direct responsibility, both for service provision and for financing them through taxation. This created, at least in principle, a direct link between political decisions and their financial consequences. The well-being services counties reform severed this link. From 2023 onward, responsibility for organizing social and healthcare services as well as rescue services was transferred to 21 well-being services counties, funded almost entirely by the state. These counties have no independent taxing authority, yet they carry extensive responsibility for statutory services. Structurally, this means that expenditures and revenues were separated from one another. In economic theory, such a model is considered inherently risky, as it weakens cost discipline and encourages expenditure growth. Despite this, Marin's government chose precisely this solution. The reform was justified in the name of equality and efficiency. In reality, the funding model contained a serious flaw from the outset. The state promised to finance the counties according to need, but without a clear and binding expenditure cap. The first years of operation quickly demonstrated where this would lead. Nearly all well-being services counties reported substantial deficits almost immediately. This was not the result of isolated mistakes, but a built-in feature of the system itself. When expenditures exceeded funding, the response was not adjustment or restraint, but additional state funding and flexibility measures. Administrative expansion was another central consequence. On top of the structures transferred from municipalities, an entirely new administrative layer was constructed. County councils, executive boards, top-level civil servants, support services, and extensive bureaucratic apparatuses. This did not eliminate overlaps, it multiplied them. Instead of savings, permanent additional costs emerged in the form of salaries, ICT systems, and ongoing administrative maintenance. The reform's promised efficiency gains remained theoretical, while its costs materialized immediately. The timetable reveals much about the quality of decision-making. The Well-being Services Counties reform was pushed through in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, at a time when public finances were already under exceptional strain. Impact assessments were based on assumptions of future savings rather than on tested mechanisms. During consultation rounds, serious criticism was raised regarding the funding model and the lack of effective steering, but these warnings were brushed aside. Political determination to deliver the reform on schedule outweighed economic prudence. In public communication, the reform was portrayed as responsible and unavoidable. When problems began to surface, the explanations shifted. Deficits were blamed alternately on the pandemic, on inflation, or on decisions made by previous governments. Rarely was it acknowledged that the funding and governance model itself was fundamentally flawed. Subsequent corrective measures, additional funding, extended deficit coverage periods, and looser steering were, in practice, concessions that the original model did not work. As Prime Minister, Sanna Marin bore the political responsibility for this entire undertaking. Her government chose a solution that further expanded the public sector at a time when Finland's state finances were already structurally in deficit. The Well-being Services Counties reform permanently committed the state to a higher level of expenditure and shifted cost pressures onto future governments and taxpayers. This was not a technical error, but a deliberate policy choice. In the end, the question is simple. Why was such a massive system launched without a mechanism to prevent the accumulation of deficits and to enforce fiscal discipline from the outset? The answer is not ignorance. The warnings existed, alternatives were presented, and the risks were known. It was a matter of political will, and that will led to an expansion of the public sector whose true bill has not yet even fully appeared in the state's financial accounts. Chapter 5. Finland's State Finances during Sanna Marin's term. State finances are not a matter of opinion. They are line after line. Debt, deficit, interest, and decisions that endure. The Marin government began its term in a situation where Finland's central government debt stood at 106.4 billion euros at the end of 2019. 4 years later, by the end of 2023, that debt had risen to approximately 156.2 billion euros, an increase of nearly 50 billion euros. This is not an abstract figure. It is the fiscal room for future budgets, narrowing year by year. The coronavirus crisis explains much, but not everything. The year 2020 was an exceptional year, during which the state adopted multiple supplementary budgets and net borrowing rose to an exceptionally high level, around 18 billion euros. By the end of that year, central government debt had already reached roughly 125 billion euros. The crisis required rapid action, and funding was needed to support businesses, municipalities, and citizens. But the crisis was not only a health crisis. It was also a test of whether political leadership could distinguish the temporary from the permanent. This is where the most difficult question of this chapter begins. What happened when the exception began to normalize? Debt did not turn downward, even as the acute lockdown phase receded. In 2021, debt had already climbed to nearly 129 billion euros. In 2022, to about 142 billion euros. In 2023, to more than 156 billion euros. Debt increased every single year, not once, not twice, but systematically. A common defense is the claim that there was no choice. To some extent, that is true. Decisions had to be made, but decisions always operate on two levels: emergency response and recovery strategy. Emergency response can be costly and still justified. A recovery strategy reveals whether the long-term consequences were understood. Finland's state finances remained on crutches even when rehabilitation should have begun. The 2020 financial statements speak a harsh language. In a single year, the state's expenditure deficit grew from roughly 1.6 billion euros to more than 12 billion euros. This was not a minor dip, but a leap into an entirely new category. It shows how quickly deficit-based fiscal policy became the new normal. When spending rises rapidly, reducing it proves politically difficult, sometimes almost impossible. This is the point where rhetoric enters the picture. We hear about stimulus, investments, and faith in the future. But debt does not respond to slogans. It responds to interest rates and credibility. In 2023, central government debt stood at roughly 156 billion euros, and the debt to GDP ratio was about 55%. Net borrowing still exceeded 14 billion euros. When the debt stock grows at this scale, changes in the interest rate environment are no longer theoretical. They translate directly into budgetary pressure. The broader picture of public finances offers no relief. In 2023, the total debt of the general government exceeded 77% of GDP, and the deficit stood at around 3%. This means the problem is not confined to a single level of administration. The combined balance of the state, municipalities, and social security funds was in deficit. Pressure cannot be alleviated by shifting costs from one pocket to another. The criticism is not that money was spent during a crisis. The criticism is that no credible exit path was built for debt policy. 4 years is a long time in state finances. Within that period, there should have been a transition from crisis mode to controlled adjustment. Under Marin's leadership, this did not happen. Debt grew in every single year of the government's term. When debt becomes a permanent instrument, politics begins to resemble a sleight of hand. Every new expenditure is justified as necessary, but few decisions explain what will be relinquished in return. State finances, however, are not a stage. They are accounting. Debt is the memory of politics, when politicians themselves hope the public will forget. The core of this chapter is cold and simple. The Marin government normalized the deficit. What began as an exception became the baseline. Debt grew from approximately 106 billion euros to more than 156 billion euros. In 2020, net borrowing was exceptionally high. In 2023, debt was still being taken on in double-digit billions. These are not interpretations or opinions. They are measurable facts. When this chapter ends, one unavoidable question remains. If 4 years were enough to increase debt by nearly 50 billion euros, what happens in the next 4 if the same mindset continues? State finances do not collapse overnight. They erode slowly, when debt becomes the default setting of politics. Chapter 6. Brand in place of power. This chapter is not about government programs, budget lines, or long-term reforms. This chapter is about power as performance. During Sanna Marin's term as Prime Minister, politics began to resemble an increasingly curated stage, where symbols displaced substance and image overtook responsibility. This is not an opinion. It is an observation that repeatedly emerges from the documented features of her conduct. Marin rose to international prominence with remarkable speed. Youth, style, and fluent one-liners turned her into a media dream. Foreign newspapers labeled her cool, fearless, and an icon. These attributes did not arise from successes in economic policy or administrative efficiency, but from images, videos, and carefully constructed appearances. This marks a fundamental departure from previous Finnish prime ministers. Politics was no longer merely communicated, it was branded. When a prime minister appears on the covers of fashion magazines without a shirt, this is not an accident or a conversation getting out of hand. It is a conscious choice. Marin herself claimed to aim for neutral dress, yet practice showed the opposite. Leather jackets, festival outfits, and glamour photographs were not isolated coincidences. They were elements of a deliberately built public image, systematically sustained. The media embraced it because it sold, and Marin knew it. The problem is not that a prime minister dresses or celebrates. The problem is timing, proportion, and the evasion of responsibility. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, Finland was under a state of exception. Businesses were shut down, people isolated, fundamental rights restricted. At the same time, the Prime Minister herself was seen in a nightclub while exposed, without her official phone, unreachable. The Chancellor of Justice deemed the conduct formally permissible, but politics is not merely jurisprudence, it is judgment. And that judgment failed. The breakfast scandal serves as a textbook example. This was not about the amount of money, it was about principle. When it emerged that taxpayer-funded benefits exceeded the practices of previous prime ministers, the response was not immediate accountability, but explanation and deflection. Only the tax authorities' ruling forced a corrective move. The pattern repeated itself. First denial, then minimization, and finally retreat under compulsion. The party videos released in the summer of 2022 completed the phenomenon. Substantively, they did not prove a crime or drug use. That is not the point of this chapter. The point is the reaction. Instead of cutting the controversy short, swiftly and clearly, the discussion dragged on for weeks. Foreign media rushed to defend the right to party, and domestic debate became polarized. Marin became a symbol, no longer an actor. And it is precisely here that responsibility disappears. When a politician turns into a symbol, all criticism can be branded an attack. A legitimate question becomes a witch hunt. A structural assessment becomes misogyny. This shield worked for a long time. The media hesitated, the opposition tread carefully, and supporters mobilized. The result was a prime minister treated by different rules than anyone else. This is not equality. This is a distortion of power. Several journalists and researchers have later noted that Marin's public image was constructed with exceptional control. Interviews were few, press conferences were arranged on her own terms, and critical discussion was shifted away from substance toward personality. This is no coincidence. It is a strategy. When the prime ministerial term ended, an unsettling vacuum remained. International reputation was bright, but the domestic reckoning stayed obscure. The economy, debt, and structures were not at the core of this brand. They remained behind the scenery. And when the scenery was dismantled, What appeared was not a strong legacy, but a pile of controversies, explanations, and defenses. Chapter 6 does not claim that Sanna Marin was incapable. It claims something worse, that she chose otherwise. She chose brand over power. She chose visibility over responsibility. And Finland paid the price for politics becoming a performance. In the next chapter, we examine what happens when the performance ends and the bill is left on the table. Chapter 7. Entrepreneurs as the Paymasters. In this chapter, the fog lifts. In this chapter, the pretending ends. When the state proved unable to restrain its spending, it went looking for a payer. The gaze did not turn toward administration, not toward structures, not toward the bloated public sector. The gaze turned toward entrepreneurs, toward those who do not go on strike, toward those who do not close their doors at 4 o'clock, toward those whose cash flow lives in reality. The entrepreneur's pension system, YEL, was taken up for reform during Marin's term in a way that shattered predictability. Publicly, the language was fairness and adequate social security. In reality, it was about money and the urgency to find more of it. The assessment of YEL work income was tightened, insurance contributions were raised, and entrepreneurs were sent a clear message. The state knows better than you what your income really is. This was not a technical adjustment. It was a principled attack on private risk. An entrepreneur's income is not a salary. It fluctuates, breaks off, collapses, and rises again. And yet the government chose a model in which a calculated, correct work income is defined from the outside. The insurance company assesses. The authority directs. The entrepreneur pays. Criticism rose immediately from the field, not from ideological opponents, but from accountants, small business owners, solo entrepreneurs, and growth companies. The message was unambiguous. Contributions rise, security does not improve, and predictability disappears. The government's responses were evasive. There was talk of long-term benefits and of what is best for entrepreneurs themselves. At the same time, the government continued a policy in which entrepreneurship was romanticized in speeches and punished in practice. Pandemic supports were distributed through heavy administration, often with delay. Many solo entrepreneurs were left outside the support schemes. When the crisis eased, what remained was a new normal: higher mandatory contributions and weaker trust. This needs to be said out loud. The YEL reform under Marin was not a social policy improvement. It was a fiscal solution. When the state's finances slid into permanent deficit, a group was sought that lacked collective bargaining power. Entrepreneurs did not march on Senate Square. They calculated invoices. They worked. They paid. The government justified its actions with studies and expert statements, but ignored what mattered most: the nature of entrepreneurship. Risk is not a flaw. It is the core of the entire system. When risk is packaged into a mandatory fee, entrepreneurship loses its appeal. Investments move elsewhere. Companies are not founded, or they are founded somewhere else. At this point, responsibility becomes personal. Sanna Marin led a government that made a conscious choice, a choice in which the private sector was seen as a funding machine, a choice in which the entrepreneur was not treated as a partner, but as a payer. Even colder is what was not done. The government did not build a flexible model in which contributions genuinely follow income. It did not offer real voluntariness. It did not secure the entrepreneur's right to define their own risk. Instead, it strengthened control and increased coercion. When entrepreneurs asked why inefficiencies in the public sector were not corrected before raising contributions, no answer came. When it was asked why deficits in well-being regions do not lead to structural cuts, the subject was changed. YEL was easier. This chapter is not an isolated episode. It is part of a pattern. The same pattern appears in state finances, in the SOTE reform, and in EU liabilities. When the money runs out, responsibility is outsourced. When the consequences materialize, they are collected from those without a megaphone. Entrepreneurs remember this. They remember who spoke of values and who sent the bill. They remember that stability vanished and was replaced by distrust. And distrust is poison to an economy that lives on investment, risk, and the courage to act. This is the quiet legacy of Marin's term. Not in ceremonial speeches, not in international awards, but in companies' financial statements. On the line that reads, "Mandatory contributions increased." Source basis, Finnish media, official policy documents, and public documentation related to the YEL reform. Chapter 8. The Quality of Decision-Making and Competence. At this point, there is no longer room for softness, no rhetoric, no sympathy. Now we examine decision-making coldly as it actually was, not as it was sold. The central problem of Sanna Marin's term as Prime Minister was not a single mistake. It was a repeating pattern. Haste, inadequate impact assessments, weak overall governance, and constant after-the-fact corrections. This does not need to be inferred from opinions. It is visible in documents, timelines, and outcomes. Major reforms require three things: time, expertise, and a willingness to listen to counter-arguments. Marin's government systematically used only one of them: fighting against time. Haste was turned into a virtue, criticism into a problem, consultation rounds into a formality. The health and social services reform is the clearest example of this. It was not a minor regulatory adjustment, but a reconstruction of the entire public service structure. Yet the funding model was pushed through without effective cost control, without realistic deficit scenarios, and without mechanisms to genuinely halt expenditure growth. This was not a difference of opinion, it was a professional failure. When the system immediately began producing deficits, the response was not accountability, but emergency fixes made after the fact. More transition periods, more flexibility, more money. The same pattern repeated. First the decision, then the problem, finally the explanation. Responsibility was dispersed, but decision-making power was kept centralized. The same phenomenon was visible in coronavirus policy. In exceptional circumstances, heavy decisions were made, but the state of exception quickly became a routine excuse. Lockdowns, restrictions, and economic support packages were extended without openly and systematically assessing their long-term effects. When the bill arrived, it was labeled a necessity. The quality of decision-making is measured by what happens afterward. During Marin's term, too many decisions required constant patching. This tells one thing: the overall picture was not under control. The government managed communication better than it managed systems. And then there is the most difficult question of all. Were experts truly listened to, or were they used merely as decorative justifications? Statements were collected, yes, but when they did not support the predetermined line, they were ignored. This is not unusual in politics. What is unusual is the scale at which this occurred. Every problem was framed as a communications challenge. If criticism grew, the cause was found in the atmosphere. If the numbers deteriorated, the fault lay with the world. If structures failed, they were someone else's legacy. This is classic defensive power politics, not leadership. Leadership means bearing responsibility even when explanations are no longer sufficient. During Marin's government term, permanent expenditures were created, structures were bloated, and systems were built that subsequent governments are still forced to repair. This is not an ideological claim. This is an economic fact. Was it ideology? Partly. Incompetence? In many cases, yes. Indifference? Perhaps not at the individual level, but at the system level, responsibility slipped away. When no one was clearly accountable for the whole failed. In this chapter, the question is no longer whether Sanna Marin was a good performer, a symbol, or the voice of her generation. The question is whether the quality of decision-making was sufficient for a small, indebted state like Finland. Based on the documents, the answer is uncomfortable. This is not a personal attack. This is a closing of the books. And in a closing of the books, the numbers do not lie. Chapter 9. International Attention and the Hollow Weight of Awards. At this point in the work, there is no longer any reason to soften the language. When examining the end of Sanna Marin's term as Prime Minister and the period that followed, two realities stand in opposition. Realities that never meet at any point. On one side stands Finland, a permanently weakened state economy, an expanded public sector, structurally underfunded well-being regions, and decisions whose correction has been deferred to future governments. On the other side stands the international stage, awards, rankings, honours, and invitations to closed rooms. The world applauded while the bill was left at home. The international narrative constructed around Marin was not based on economic outcomes, administrative efficiency, or long-term sustainability. It was built on symbols, on youth, on rhetoric, on values that sounded right but were never tied to measurable results. When she was elevated as influential and brave, no one asked what was being influenced and at whose expense. This is not an accident. This is a system. International rankings and honours measure visibility, not responsibility. They reward the story, not the balance sheet. They contain no column for debt, no footnote for the deficits of well-being regions. They do not ask why emergency-era policies became a permanent condition. As symbolic capital increased, economic capital eroded. And no one connected these two out loud. What is particularly revealing is how immediate and frictionless the transition to international roles was after the prime ministerial term ended. There was no interim reckoning, no moment where one stopped to assess what remained behind. Political responsibility was converted into personal career capital. This is not a crime, but it is a moral question that no one wanted to ask. When responsibility disappears beyond the horizon, only consequences remain. Domestic debate was often reduced to the individual. Criticism was not treated as economic policy analysis, but as an attitude problem. Structural failures were reframed as value disputes. At the same time, in international media, Finland was compressed into a single face, a single story, a single easily marketable symbol. Reality was too complex, too uncomfortable, and too heavy to be rewarded. This is a dangerous model for a small state. When external admiration overrides internal evaluation, democracy loses one of its most essential safeguards. Awards and titles begin to function as a shield behind which political responsibility can hide. They create the illusion of success even when the numbers say otherwise. Debt is not an opinion. It is a fact. Sanna Marin's legacy is not what international headlines claimed it to be. It is what the next governments were forced to confront on their very first day in office. Funding gaps, rigid structures, an inflated administration. Decisions that can no longer be undone without pain. These cannot be awarded away. Awards do not carry responsibility. States do. This chapter does not deny that Marin was exceptionally visible. She was. But visibility is not the same as success. History does not measure leaders by how often they were invited onto the stage, but by what remained when the lights went out. Display cases fill up, budget frameworks break apart, and responsibility, it stayed in Finland. Epilogue. A balance sheet, not an afterword. An epilogue is not a polished summary. It is a cold ledger. At this point, the story ceases to be about an individual and becomes a story about the state, and about what happens when power is exercised through images, exceptions, and a permanent language of crisis. This is not an emotional outburst. This is analysis. Sanna Marin's term as Prime Minister was built on crises. That much is true. But a crisis is not an exemption from accountability. A crisis is a test. And in that test, one thing is measured above all else. Can leadership distinguish the temporary from the permanent, the exception from the norm, the gesture from the structure? In this test, Finland slid into a direction where the exception became a justification, and the justification hardened into routine. Political language grew harsher, while substance grew thinner. Decisions were justified with morality, not with proportions. Criticism was framed as coldness, warnings as irresponsibility, and calculation as heartlessness. When politics is driven this way, the economy does not disappear. It is merely deferred, billed to the future. Public debt grew rapidly. This is not an opinion, but an observation. Debt is neither an abstract word nor an ideological slur. It is a contract with future taxpayers. And it is precisely in this contract that the legacy of the Marin era weighs heavily. As interest rates rise and economic growth slows, every permanent lock-in of expenditure turns into pain felt only later. Solidarity was emphasized in speeches. Rigidity was increased in structures. Administration was expanded at a moment when steering capacity weakened and the boundaries of responsibility blurred. When a system is fragmented, responsibility fragments with it. In the end, no one is accountable for the whole, yet everyone is responsible for a part. And that is exactly how the whole slips out of control. This is an old trick of power. Build the machinery, raise your hands, and say there are no levers left. Decisions made under emergency conditions also left their mark on the culture of law and trust. When movement is restricted, livelihoods are shut down, and everyday life is regulated, extreme care, precision, and retrospective self-criticism are required. Instead, what was seen was self-confidence in which doubts were dismissed with moral superiority. That is a dangerous combination. At the same time, the political stage filled with symbols. The attention economy devoured deliberation. The personal brand grew, while the institution shrank. When public debate focuses on how leadership looks, it stops asking where leadership is taking the country. That is the moment when democracy begins to fall asleep
at its post. Each scandal on its own was small. Together, they formed a picture of a culture in which the everyday discipline of power lost its meaning. When leadership turns episodic, continuity disappears. And without continuity, economic policy is no longer policy. It is reaction. At this point, it must be said plainly. Defending the term by appealing to a historic time is intellectual laziness. History does not erase responsibility. It increases it. Precisely in difficult times, restraints, metrics, and the ability to say no are needed. If everything is answered with yes, only the bill remains. The reform of the social and healthcare structure is an example of this. It locked in cost trajectories and dispersed steering at a moment when state finances demanded clarity and discipline. When a system of this magnitude is transferred into a new form, the consequences do not appear immediately. They appear years later, when expenditures continue to grow and corrective action becomes painful.
EU money was sold as salvation. In Finland's case, it was more like a financial loop. Finland is a net contributor in the recovery package, expected to pay more than it receives. In 2020, Finland estimated it would pay about 6.6 billion euros and receive about 3.2 billion euros in return. Yes, Finland can still receive EU grants through Next Generation EU, including up to 1.8 billion euros in RRF grants and up to 2.6 billion euros in total NGEU grants. And Finland has received an advance payment, but none of that changes the core point. Billions do not fix the problem if structural spending grows faster than capacity. Funding does not make decisions sustainable. Sustainability arises only when expenditure and responsibility move hand in hand. The final claim of this work is this: Marin's legacy is not style, courage, or international attention. It is a pile of decisions that shifted risk forward, expanded administration, and normalized the exception. It is a legacy in which the bill was left for others to pay. This is not a personal attack. This is an assessment of the use of power. Democracy does not need heroes. It needs accountability. And accountability begins only when images step aside and the numbers are left on the table. The epilogue does not close the book. It opens its heaviest chapter: dismantling, cutting, prioritizing. What the next governments will be forced to do without applause. This is the moment when truth hardens, not into a shout, but into a demand. Remember this: a state does not live on emotional rhetoric. It lives on the balance sheet. And the balance sheet does not lie.
If this work resonated with you, if these pages made you pause, question, or feel uncomfortable, then do not let it disappear into silence. Like this post, not for me, for the fact that this was said at all. Because silence is how this system survives. Because numbers don't lie, but they are buried when no one listens. If you want more of this, more documents, more decisions exposed, more consequences named, make it visible. Share it. Amplify it. This is not content. This is a reckoning. And it does not end here.